I love flying. Growing up, we drove just about everywhere. I can remember long road trips in the summer. We went to the Grand Canyon and back. We went to North Dakota and back. And I wasn't able to take my first flight until I was 16 years old. And it was everything I hoped it would be. And one of my favorite parts of flying is coming into and going out of SeaTac Airport. I love trying to figure out what I'm flying over and sort of pointing out different locations or points of interest to whoever is sitting beside me, typically my wife, who really isn't that impressed. But there is something about being at a higher elevation that provides a different perspective. Okay, things that loom large on the ground look small and insignificant when we get higher up. Places that can seem so far away suddenly don't look as distant. And I've hoped you've had a great Christmas so far and that you've had a chance to open some gifts. And I wanted today to give you one more unexpected gift for Christmas. Okay, so don't get your hopes up. There isn't something coming in the mail. This isn't a tangible gift. But it's something I wish could be given to each of us as we come to the close of 2021. You ready for this? Perspective. Maybe that doesn't excite you, but I believe it should. As we're in the last week of this year, I would love to give each of us a new perspective, a bigger perspective. And I was doing some research, and I found out that word, perspective, it originated as an art term. It was a method of showing distance in a picture by making far away objects smaller. And I've got an example here from an early artist employing some of the linear perspective techniques, and this was in the 1400s. And this was really a revolutionary technique, not for any other reason than because it brought depth to an image. It allowed something to be seen as it really was. And that's exactly what I'm talking about here with perspective. I would love for each of us to have the ability to see this year, to see our lives and our faith with a new depth, to see it as it really is. And if I could sum up the message in a big idea, it would be this: looking to Jesus provides a greater perspective. Looking to Jesus provides a greater perspective. And we're going to be looking at a passage in the New Testament book of Hebrews, which was a letter written to Jewish followers of Jesus who were likely facing persecution and the temptation to slip back into old ways of relating to God. And that can be a struggle even for us today. I'm not going to speak for you, I'll just speak for myself. But when we face challenges in life, we can gravitate to what's comfortable. And for me, something that I struggle with is when it comes to food. When I'm stressed out or I'm facing a difficult challenge, I can go to comfort foods. I can run to that, which, believe it or not, those aren't the healthiest foods for me. And that's just a way that sometimes I deal with things that are hard. And it's not healthy, but it's what my inclination is. And that is what's happening with this unknown church, these unknown churches that are the audience of Hebrews. And so we're going to jump into Hebrews chapter 12, and we'll start reading in verse 1 of Hebrews 12. So Hebrews 12 starting in verse 1. I'm going to be reading out of the New Testament for everyone. What about us then? We have such a great cloud of witnesses all around us. What we must do is this: we must put aside each heavy weight and the sin which gets in the way so easily. We must run the race that lies in front of us, and we must run it patiently. We must look ahead to Jesus. He is the one who carved out the path for faith, and he's the one who brought it to completion. Okay, the writer here starts by calling us to have a bigger perspective, to move beyond just seeing what's happening in this moment in time, but to start by looking back, right? To recognize that we are part of a long line of those who have faithfully followed Jesus. And I don't have time to read Hebrews 11. I would encourage you, it's a great chapter. And really what it is, it's called the faith chapter. And it's full of stories of faith throughout the Bible. It would be something like if there was a hall of fame, but biblical, it'd be called like a hall of faith. And it's examples of people throughout the Bible, both named and unnamed, that exemplified trusting God no matter the circumstances. And now in chapter 12, the focus turns from the past, turns from looking at this sort of amazing lineage of faith in Scripture, and now it turns to you and me today. Okay, what about us? How are we going to respond? And it's a call for us to take a bigger perspective, to see stories throughout Scripture where people not only, they trusted God not knowing the outcome. And then for us now to follow in their footsteps, to metaphorically step into the arena, as we get this sort of sports metaphor, and run the race. And there are 3 action steps in this passage that I want to encourage us with today. And the first one is this: we must put aside the heavy weights. In verse 1, that's the first thing it says we should do. And if you look into the Greek here, one of the translations for this phrase could be to trim off the excess fat. And boy, does that ever hit close to home. It's really accurate, right, for this time of year, especially after all of the amazing Christmas treats I'm sure you, as well as I, have had the chance to enjoy. Okay, we all have things that can weigh us down, that can keep us from freely moving forward in what God has called us to. And where does that heaviness come from? Here's where I think it comes from. Okay, things we carry that we shouldn't. And I think of Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. Here's what it says. And Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Let me teach you, because I am humble and gentle at heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy to bear, and the burden I give you is light." These are such life-giving words, and yet at times I find myself arguing with Jesus here. Like, what do you mean easy? What do you mean light and restful? It doesn't always feel like that when it comes to faith, right? Life is hard, and following Jesus can be difficult in the world that we live in. So was Jesus being naive here? No. Now, he faced opposition, right? He knew what it was to have to go against the flow. He faced opposition to the point that the religious leaders had him killed. So how can Jesus speak of rest, of a yoke, or teaching that is easy and light? Well, maybe we're carrying things we aren't meant to. Is it possible we've added more than Jesus has called us to? Too often, we do so much for Jesus instead of choosing to be with Jesus. And that's the promise in these words. He says, "Come to me." Come to Jesus. Be with him. His yoke, his way of living is easy and light, because we don't shoulder things alone, but can allow him to take them from us. He put down the heavy weights and sin, right, that trips us up. And we don't need to spend a lot of time on that. We get that. So we're supposed to do that, and it says, so what? The second action in this verse is this: we must run with endurance. Again, in the last part of Hebrews 12, verse 1, it says, all right, we must run the race that lies in front of us, and we must run it patiently. And there's a huge difference between a marathon and a sprint. And I often joke that I have the body, okay, that's built for a sprint, not a marathon. And ideally, a sprint going downhill. The patience is hard. But we aren't called to focus on what we can't see, but to run the race that lies right in front of us. And I'm reminded of another promise from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount that we've looked at this fall. In Matthew 6, verse 34, here's what Jesus said. He says, so don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will bring its own worries. Today's trouble is enough for today. Do you ever find yourself worrying about things that haven't even happened yet? Right? There are times where I'm worried or I'm frustrated. I just can sense it in my body, and it's something there, and I can't pin down what it is. And I have to stop and sort of ask myself, like, why am I feeling what I'm feeling? And honestly, there are times when I don't have a good answer to that question. Or if I do, it's a potential outcome that hasn't even happened yet. When you run a marathon, you can't think about miles 15 or 16. Okay? You can only focus on what's in front of you. And I know the same is true of hiking. There are some really great trails around this area that are a lot of fun to hike. And when you hike, it's all about setting a pace. Now, you can choose and try to run up a trail, but it will start and it'll be start and stop, and you won't really enjoy the process all too much. The goal is to set a pace. Focus on steady breathing. Keep putting one foot in front of another. And of course, enjoy the journey. The same is true for our journey of faith. Following Jesus one step at a time. We're told to set a pace or rhythm. And that is something we're going to talk about more this next year. I'm really excited about that. And the writer here in Hebrews 12, he gives us one more action. Okay, he says we must look ahead to Jesus. The third thing we're told to do, what we must do, is found in the beginning of verse 2. We must look ahead to Jesus. He is the one who carved out the path for faith, and he's the one who brought it to completion. And we're not only called to remember what has come before us, right? To see those that have gone before us. And not only are we told to run the race that's right in front of us, but we're also to look ahead. And that's what it means to gain a bigger perspective, right? To see things as they are in three dimensions, right? This past, this present, this future. And it's so important to not only look behind or to get stuck in looking at what's right in front of us, but to keep our eyes forward on what is to come. And I love this story. In 1952, young Florence Chadwick stepped into the waters of the Pacific Ocean off Catalina Island. She was determined to swim to the shore of mainland California. And she'd already been the first woman to swim the English Channel both ways, which is pretty amazing. And the weather was really foggy and chilly, and she actually had a boat following with guns to scare off sharks. Like, this is pretty serious stuff. But she could hardly see where she was going. And she swam for 15 hours when finally she begged to be taken out of the water. And in the boat that was following alongside, her mom said, keep going, keep going. She told her she was close and that she could make it. But finally, physically and emotionally exhausted, Florence stopped swimming and was pulled out. And it wasn't until she was on the boat that she discovered that the shore was less than half a mile away. Amazing, right? At a news conference the next day, here's what she said. All I could see was the fog. I think if I could have seen the shore, I would have made it. And that story has always stuck with me. If I could only have seen the shore, I would have made it. And it reminds me of an illustration we used to do a lot when I was a youth pastor. We would get two unknowing students to volunteer. And we'd have them separately each step in barefoot into a bucket of ice-cold water. And the goal was to stay in the water as long as physically possible. And the first student would always have it the worst because they would have to do this blindfolded and without any audience support. As you might imagine, they would not last too long in the frigid water. But for the second student, we would do just the opposite. And they get no blindfold, and they would have the audience cheering them on. And they would be able to know the time to beat and could watch the clock counting down. And without fail, the second student would always win. And typically, they would stay in the water longer than was necessary to beat the other student's time. Why? Because they could see the finish line. And that connects so well to this passage. since we are surrounded right by this vast crowd of faithful people, right, cheering us on to the finish line. And we can look to Jesus, right? When we got that going for us, we can't fail. I think of Florence. I think if she could have heard a crowd cheering as she swam, she probably would have made it as well. In fact, she would try this same stretch again a few months later and successfully complete the swim from California, or from Catalina Island to California. And what she said was she kept the shore in her mind the whole time. That's what helped. Right? Again, perspective is so important. When our perspective is merely on what is right in front of us, we can be discouraged. We can wonder whether it's worth moving forward. We are to look to Jesus. Look to Jesus because, as it says in our passage, he is the one who carved out the path for faith. And he's the one who brought it to completion. And I chose this translation specifically for these words. Okay, Jesus has carved out the path for faith. Okay, he's the front runner in this marathon. He's the one setting the pace. So often we focus on what or who is around us. We try to look to them to sort of set this pace, and we try and keep up with someone else's expectation of the good life. And that only will end in discontentment. That's the only way that ends for us. But if we look ahead to Jesus, not only has he carved out the path, not only is he the pace setter, but he's the one cheering us on to the finish line. And I want to close by reading one more section from Hebrews 12, because this isn't something Jesus just calls us to. He says, you should do this. This would be really good for you. No, he modeled this for us. Let's pick up in Hebrews 12, the second half of verse 2. He knew that there was joy spread out in waiting for him. That's why he endured the cross, making light of its shame, and has now taken his seat at the right hand of God's throne. He put up with enormous opposition from sinners. Weigh up in your minds just how severe it was. Then you won't find yourselves getting weary and worn out. Jesus knew what he would have to go through, right? The shame of the cross, the pain of a most brutal execution, and choosing on top of that to bear, right, the weight of the world's sin and brokenness. But he chose to endure. He chose to move forward, not because he's a masochist, but because of the joy spread out and waiting for him. Right? The joy of looking forward and seeing our lives restored, and for the family of God to expand. And we're told here by this author to consider Jesus. Weigh up just how severe the opposition was that he faced. And then what is the result of that? It says, then you won't find yourself getting weary and worn out. If you're feeling weary and worn out in this season, if this year hasn't been what you'd hoped it would be, if you're wondering where to go from here, is there something or something for us to look forward to find joy in? I would encourage you to look to Jesus. Consider Jesus. He's the one who's carved out this journey of faith, and he can see you through to its completion. And as I wrap up this message, I have just a few next steps for us to wrestle with. And the first is become a follower of Jesus. Has your perspective been merely on the situation you're in? Do you look around and wonder where there could be hope in this world? Our hope isn't in what happens to us. Just as those in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11, they were able to journey forward in difficult and just dire situations. If they can do that, so can we when we look to Jesus. He has made a way for us to be joy-filled, to be free from the grips of sin and death. And it was something he willingly took on for you and me. It's his mercy and grace. It's his great love for us. If you want to receive the life he came to bring, would you let us know either through the chat on this message? You can email me, mmiller@oasishomechurch.com. I'd love to help you take next steps. Another next step is this. Put aside the heavy weights. Are you carrying things you shouldn't? Are you struggling, and is there sin that just keeps tripping you up? We're called to run with endurance, and those things are going to frustrate and slow our pace. If there are things Jesus is asking you to lay down, would you invite him to take that from you? It could just be a simple prayer saying, Jesus, help. I don't want to carry these heavy weights. Or Jesus, forgive me for the sin and struggle that continues to trip me up. Would you forgive me and set me free? I know he hears those prayers every time. And the last next step is this: look to Jesus. And this is pretty simple, right? We're to focus on Jesus. Allow him to give you a greater perspective. If life is full of worry and weariness, look to Jesus. If all is going well, look to Jesus. If you're questioning what should be your next step in life, look to Jesus. He's the one who knows the way. He's the one who's carved out the path of faith, and he will lead you to its completion. I hope you have a great week, Oasis, and I look forward to what God has in store for our home churches as we move, believe it or not, into 2022. God bless, Oasis.